A number of the nation's largest newspapers, and I don't say this lightly, I have a huge amount of respect for the media, but a number of the nation's largest newspapers made an age-old mistake today. They took the words of the Trump administration at face value and spit them right back out to the American public without context, without much of anything. Here were some of the headlines this afternoon. Here's one from the Wall Street Journal. Trump's Iran decision to come within 2 weeks. From the Washington Post, Trump says he'll decide on Iran strike within 2 weeks. And from the Associated Press, Trump says he'll decide whether U.S. will directly attack Iran within 2 weeks. Now, those headlines all stem from what Karoline Leavitt read today at today's White House press briefing.
Now, regarding the ongoing situation in Iran, I know there has been a lot of speculation amongst all of you in the media regarding the president's decision-making and whether or not the United States will be directly involved. In light of that news, I have a message directly from the president, and I quote, "Based on the fact that there's a substantial chance of negotiations that may or may not take place with Iran in the near future, I will make my decision whether or not to go within the next 2 weeks." That's a quote directly from the president for all of you today.
I will make my decision whether or not to go within the next 2 weeks. That's a quote directly from the president. All of that in isolation, if it was from another White House, it makes it sound like the current president wants to give himself and his advisors time to really consider, one of the most serious foreign policy decisions a president can make. He wants to be clear, maybe, to the public that they can expect a decision from him in 2 weeks. That would be under a normal presidency. And sure, I guess there's a percentage chance that's what's going on this time. But the very important context that is completely missing, no surprise, from Karoline's announcement or statement or reading of the statement and all those headlines is this: I'll get to it in 2 weeks is one of Donald Trump's absolute favorite tactics. He literally uses it all the time. And most of the time, in fact, almost every time, when 2 weeks rolls around, Trump has either completely forgotten about whatever it was he promised in the first place, or, and I think this is more likely than the first one, he's hoping people have just moved on. That the news cycle is on to something else. Maybe something else he fabricated. Maybe just something else in general. He's already done this at least 10 times in the 6 months since he took office. 10 times.
We're going to be sending letters out in about a week and a half, 2 weeks. I can't tell you that, but I'll let you know in about 2 weeks, within 2 weeks. I could answer that question better in 2 weeks. I'll do this at some point over the next 2 weeks. I'll announce it over the next 2 weeks. I'll tell you about that in a month from now or 2 weeks from now. You trust President Putin? In about 2 weeks. You can ask that question in 2 weeks, and we'll see. It'll be out in about less than 2 weeks. We're going to start selling, hopefully, in about 2 weeks.
About 2 weeks. Maybe it's a tick. Maybe he read a marketing report that says people move on in the media. Who knows? But the point is, it's a tactic that Trump has used on almost every issue. From his fake timeline around Russia-Ukraine peace negotiations to his made-up timelines around big trade deals. Where are all those big trade deals, everyone? To his issuing visas for high-skilled immigrants. He claims it all is coming in just 2 weeks. Of course, it never does. And honestly, it's a bit maddening that this tactic can still spark headlines like all of the ones I read earlier. Because it's not new. He did the exact same thing throughout his first term in office.
We're going to be announcing something, I would say, over the next 2 or 3 weeks. I'll be making a big decision on the Paris Accord over the next 2 weeks. We are coming out with that plan in 2 weeks. We'll be reporting back sometime over the next 2 weeks. You'll be seeing that over the next 2 weeks. Over the next 2 weeks. And it doesn't have to be today. It can be tomorrow. And it can be in 2 weeks from now.
Could be in 2 weeks from now. Could be in 2 weeks. Notice the pattern there? It's a big pattern. I could honestly spend half the show just showing you clips of Donald Trump promising to do something in exactly 2 weeks. You can Google it. There's lots that he never ended up doing. And we've kind of known about this forever. This was the headline from Bloomberg less than 6 months into Trump's first term. Here it is, quote, "In Trump's White House, everything's coming in 2 weeks." So what should we actually take away from Trump's 2-week deadline on Iran? Because that's what we're talking about and dealing with now. Well, one likely possibility is that Trump doesn't want to have to make a decision about this at all. He just wants to keep punting it down the road. He doesn't mind the speculation, the attention, but he doesn't want to actually commit to a decision, and it's not hard to see why.
Businesses across this country are bracing for an immigration crackdown. Today, the White House border czar Tom Homan said the administration will continue its raid at work sites, including farms and hotels. But he did clarify that arresting criminals comes first. Now, I want to be clear. There is not a business, not one that I cover, big or small, that is advocating in any way for illegal immigration. But what we do have in this country, from our dairy farms, restaurants, fisheries, meatpacking plants, to our small businesses, to our biggest multinational corporations, is a plain and simple labor shortage. And these are often low-paying, physically grueling jobs, farm workers, roofers. Nearly 1 in 8 of them are undocumented. But I want to also understand that they're also entrepreneurs, starting businesses and hiring people. They are part of our communities, contributing to the growth of our economy. They pay billions in federal, state, and local taxes, not to mention paying into Social Security and Medicaid programs they're not even eligible for. And the fact is, businesses have been advocating for something. They've been advocating for comprehensive immigration reform for years and years, to find ways to bring workers into this country legally. But unfortunately, we do not have a system yet that can actually process them in a timely and fair way. And since this very public ICE raid situation started, well, you know what we haven't heard? We haven't heard about any companies that are saying how they are filling those jobs with American citizens who've been waiting in the wings to work an 8-hour shift cutting chicken parts in a 40-degree meat locker, or wash dishes for hours and hours at a local diner. Immigrants are a key part of the engine that keeps America running. That has always been the case. And it is part of what has made our nation so successful. So if we care about growing our economy, about making sure we have food on our tables, roofs over our heads, from the people I speak to in the business community, they say rather than spending all of this time and energy on deporting people or arguing about not deporting people, let us all find a way to collectively make this work for everyone. Former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance joins me now. She spent 25 years as a federal prosecutor. Joyce, before we get to that, we do have breaking news tonight. We just learned in the last few minutes. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals is siding with the Trump administration and allowing the president to keep control of the California National Guard that is deployed in Los Angeles. What do you think? When just walk us through this decision, what it means and what happens next.
Right. So this is the 3-0 panel decision from the Ninth Circuit that had been widely predicted. The panel, during oral argument, made it pretty clear that they believed that the Trump administration was entitled to deference and that the president's decision that he could federalize the National Guard to help him enforce the laws of the United States was something that would stand. So this stuff is another one of these cases that we're at a very early stage in. This isn't a final decision on the merits. This is another decision about injunctions and what the status quo will look like while the litigation moves forward. The status quo here is that President Trump retains control of the National Guard for the 90-day period that he federalized them during, and now the litigation proceeds.
All right, well, let's talk about these raids. What do you make of Tom Homan's comments that raids on work sites will continue, but they will prioritize criminals, right? They're not saying they won't go for others, but criminals, there will be their top picks.
Well, look, the Justice Department is more than capable of handling criminal aliens in this country. In fact, that's a mainstay. It's one of the largest tranches of cases that federal prosecutors do annually, and it's been that way for a couple of decades. There's statutory law that lets you prosecute people who illegally re-enter the United States after being deported. And when those people are violent criminals or gang affiliated, there are enhanced penalties. So that's bread and butter work for federal prosecutors. That's not what's happening when ICE is out at job sites picking up workers, or when it goes to parking lots to try to find people who are looking for day labor work, or when it goes to schools. And so I think, this is one of those cases where there is politics and then there is policy. And what we are seeing is politics and what this administration thinks will make a favorable impression on voters, but it's not the kind of policy we need for immigration, which has been, I think everyone agrees, right, a broken system, a system that needed a fix. Last year, Democrats brought forward an immigration plan that gave Republicans virtually everything that they had been asking for over a decade. But Donald Trump wanted to be able to run on immigration as an issue. He urged Republicans in Congress to reject that compromise bill. And so the broken immigration system continues.
The nationwide broad resistance against President Trump's agenda is growing measurably. We saw the No Kings protest with over 5 million people across 2,000 cities and towns. And the media covered it as it happened, which undercuts some of the other narrative in D.C. especially about a supposedly weakened or exhausted Trump resistance.
Demonstrators gathered in large cities and small towns from coast to coast to oppose President Trump's policies.
Demonstrations spotted in Phoenix, Raleigh, and West Palm Beach, just to name a few.
Accused the president of stepping into authoritarianism.
About 100 to 250,000 protesters have filled this street.
This was a historic day of protest in the U.S.
The opposition against him is big, deep, growing, confident, and increasingly unstoppable.
Growing and increasingly unstoppable, as Rachel put it. And that reflects something that we can measure. This is a big deal. It wasn't just a one-off or a one day, even though it was quite the historic turnout for a day. And if you get out of sort of the endless sort of political narrative thing and just look at, say, how papers and people on the ground saw it, major cities to small towns, this is front page. This was big. It happened in a way that really got that local traction as the lived experience of huge gatherings far outside of campaign season. Around the world, many look over at the United States and recognize this as huge civic action, something that in some countries is a more common and, frankly, sometimes more respected contemporary occurrence than it is here. And yet tonight, days later, here we are. Much of the political world has moved on. And the D.C. press, and again, like any grouping, there's caveats and exceptions, but a lot of the D.C. press viewed this as a 1 or 2 day story. But is it? These protests are ongoing. And if they're just a 1 or 2 day story, the premise would be that it's somehow routine. Thing happened, tell you about it the day of, day after, move on. But right now, I want to go through the evidence that states otherwise, that we are not witnessing some small or routine thing, but rather a gigantic awakening and ongoing effort to resist what are extreme, sometimes rare events coming out of Trump's White House. When I say rare, I mean seizing powers that no one's tried in a half century. Sending in the National Guard, no one's tried that without a governor's approval in 60 years. Telling the Supreme Court sometimes they might not follow things and then weeks later following it. We don't have that on the modern record, not since the Civil War. Now, if this isn't getting the right coverage, by which I mean accurate, it could partly be because the media landscape is changing. Much of the more modern new media spaces are on digital and podcast platforms, and they currently lean right. And that might be a space where the protests are not a week-long story, not something they're celebrating, maybe not something they even want to get into the day it happens. Now, a longtime media member and critic, The Guardian's Margaret Sullivan, who's worked as an ombudsman, thinks deeply about how the press works. Even before the protest, she wrote about how the media in D.C. and elsewhere sometimes ignores anti-Trump protests because the companies are afraid that prominent protest coverage will be criticized by the right as partisan. And they, the press, cannot bear that label. She also argues that not only is the problem of fear going on, which is ironically something that the protests are protesting about, right? You fear a government reaction. You fear the powerful right wing saying you're partisan. But that's what the protesters are saying. We should have free speech regardless of what they say. She also argues that there's a kind of capitalist catering that goes on when conservatives have the upper hand right now, and they did show improving numbers in the elections. Quote, corporate media decision makers are fearful of losing right-leaning readers and viewers, she argues. So that's some of the concern from a very experienced member of the press. She's worked at big outlets about what's happening. But honest press is supposed to be honest, not catering to a bottom line. And that takes us to another piece of this tonight. Because some of the same types of outlets, looking at another protest movement that was smaller than this one, thought it was more important, treated it as a long-term story, even with far smaller numbers than this past weekend. Any guesses out there? If I can hear you in your living rooms. I'm talking about the right-wing Tea Party, which grew in response to Obama being elected and had people out in the streets and was treated by these same outlets I'm mentioning as a huge, big, important deal. It was treated as a political fact almost among many outlets and D.C. types that the Democrats and Obama himself, newly elected with a mandate, would have to take this seriously and respond to the concerns of this big protest movement. It was covered more than 1 or 2 days. And their turnout numbers were much lower than this past weekend, but many in the press thought the Tea Party was a game changer.
The media, all they're talking about, or strangely not talking about, are the Tea Parties. For the life of them, they can't figure out what these Tea Parties are.
Thousands of activists held rallies in cities across the country protesting big government.
Fox News covered these Tea Parties, and we were one of the only organizations to give it any publicity or PR.
A movement championed.
Everything is big in Texas.
By high-profile conservatives.
We watched Mary on Fox News with her, 12 protesters, and that's really where it started.
So what started as perhaps organic and then also had a lot of money from the Koch brothers and other things, got some momentum, but it also got a lot of air cover, a lot of national emphasis on the Tea Party. And it wasn't an isolated incident.
Here's Fox correspondent Griff Jenkins doing a live shot, and keep an eye on what his producer is doing. Now, call me old-fashioned. I don't think a producer should be whipping up the crowd. If Glenn Beck wants to be a cheerleader for conservative protests, fine. But what you just saw amounts to choreographing the story to get people hollering.
People were hollering. But given that we have this actual recent comparison, the Trump era came after the Obama era, let's just look at the facts of those protests. Because at the time, the demonstrators numbered into the tens of thousands, according to a September 2009 account in the New York Times. Now, that's a big protest. I've been to cover protests. Sometimes a few thousand feels like a lot if they're packed in and loud. Tens of thousands is certainly big, and you can cover it. But where does that compare to 5 million people in one day this weekend? Indeed, at their height, the Tea Party estimates would still have you, and we checked this today, be 1/20th of what we saw just this weekend alone. 20 times the number of protests. And remember, unlike some of that Glenn Beck stuff, the No Kings rally, shout out to some of the organizers, best we can tell, was organized, but from the ground up. You did not see a Glenn Beck type on the left, let alone many elected Democrats actually taking the lead. Now, there's a broader history in this country, of course. Protests so large they could not be ignored. Consider back in the early 60s when MLK led the history-making March on Washington. And within months, there was polling that most Americans thought even a peaceful protest like that, and again, there was other controversies in that era, but even peaceful protests, mass demonstrations, would hurt the fight for racial equality. We mentioned that with a note of humility. The people then, like the people now, including me, the voice you're hearing, don't know what's going to happen. We could be wrong. They were wrong because they overwhelmingly thought it would hurt, and they were skeptical of getting out there. Today, we have millions of Americans mobilized in a way that is absolutely huge. Now, one Harvard study, the Tea Party, showed that Republicans thought they were improving their voter turnout because the protests did bring in new people. And there's a long-running debate over whether that kind of energy ultimately was a precursor to the MAGA era, and a party that was once seen as back on its heels definitely got aggressive. Does any of this translate to the Democrats in the coming elections? We don't know. But apart from elections themselves, we are living through something that is as big as the people involved, and the narrators, whether they're on podcasts or traditional DC media, might be missing it, might be treating this as a 1 or 2 day thing that's not as big as the Tea Party, when if you check the numbers, at its height, it's 20 times the turnout and national movement of that sometimes very hyped Tea Party movement.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. The White House now says Donald Trump will decide in 2 weeks whether the United States will join Israel's war on Iran. Of course, as many have noted, when he says 2 weeks, it often just means he's not going to make a decision either way. Of course, war with Iran would be madness, and we know that. Well, we can be pretty sure about it because we all lived through the last reckless regime change war of choice in the region initiated by a Republican president. The Iraq War, of course, an unmitigated disaster, perhaps the biggest foreign policy blunder in my lifetime. Thousands of American soldiers lost their lives. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians were killed. It led to the creation of ISIS. It was a disaster for America standing abroad. The region was completely destabilized for over a decade. And here we are at home, where it really hurt the Republican Party, which led directly to the nomination and subsequent election of none other than Donald Trump in 2016. Of course, we entered that war in Iraq under false pretenses. As early as the day of the September 11th attacks, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld was working to somehow use the attacks as justification for an unrelated war in Iraq. The Bush administration lied about the connections between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. They lied about Hussein having or imminently developing weapons of mass destruction.
We have no indication that Saddam Hussein has ever abandoned his nuclear weapons program. On the contrary, we have more than a decade of proof that he remains determined to acquire nuclear weapons. What I want to bring to your attention today is the potentially much more sinister nexus between Iraq and the al-Qaeda terrorist network, a nexus that combines classic terrorist organizations and modern methods of murder. Iraq today harbors a deadly terrorist network headed by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, an associate and collaborator of Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda lieutenants.
Now, that speech was based on faulty intelligence and over the objections of multiple reports from the State Department questioning that intelligence. Iraq did not have an active biological weapons program, nor did it have an active nuclear weapons program when the Bush administration used them as justification for the war. There was no credible link between Iraq and al-Qaeda. Now, Colin Powell insisted he did not knowingly lie to the UN and to the world. He later said the origins of the speech did not come from the intelligence agencies or his own State Department, but rather from Vice President Dick Cheney's office. The Bush administration wanted to exploit Secretary Powell's reputation in order to launder faulty intelligence. Well, here we are. It's 22 years later, and God, it sure looks like it's happening again. We are being told without evidence or with faulty intelligence that Iran is actively developing weapons of mass destruction. Therefore, war is not only inevitable, but necessary. But as it turns out, it's much easier this time. The Trump administration doesn't need a speech at the UN when they can just deceptively edit video of their own director of national intelligence saying that Iran is not close to obtaining a nuke to make it sound like she was saying the opposite. Here's what the White House tweeted out yesterday.
In the past year, we've seen an erosion of a decades-long taboo in Iran on discussing nuclear weapons in public, likely emboldening nuclear weapons advocates within Iran's decision-making apparatus. Iran's enriched uranium stockpile is at its highest levels and is unprecedented for a state without nuclear weapons.
sounds ominous. That sounds threatening. Here's what Director Gabbard actually said in context.
The IC continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Supreme Leader Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear weapons program that he suspended in 2003. The IC continues to monitor closely if Tehran decides to reauthorize its nuclear weapons program. In the past year, we've seen an erosion of a decades-long taboo in Iran on discussing nuclear weapons in public, likely emboldening nuclear weapons advocates within Iran's decision-making apparatus. Iran's enriched uranium stockpile is at its highest levels and is unprecedented for a state without nuclear weapons.
Okay, that's a pretty big difference, right? The critical first line. The intelligence community continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, that in fact it hasn't been authorized by the supreme leader. That's a pretty important context. Of course, the White House has found someone who will say Iran is days away from a nuke, regardless of the intelligence. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the same guy who came to Congress on the anniversary of 9/11 to call for war with Iraq and who's been claiming that Iran will have a nuke any day now for decades.
Are there any other nations that you would recommend that the United States launch preemptive attacks upon at this point?
No, the issue is not. First of all, are there other nations that are developing nuclear weapons? Yes.
Should we launch any other preemptive attacks?
First, let me say what they are, and then let me make a suggestion how to proceed.
Thank you.
The answer is categorically yes. The two nations that are competing with each other, who will be the first to achieve nuclear weapons, is Iraq and Iran. And Iran, by the way, is also outpacing Iraq in the development of ballistic missile systems. This is not a hypothesis. It is fact. Iraq, Iran, and Libya are racing to develop nuclear weapons. Obviously, we like to see a regime change, at least I would, in Iran, just as I would like to see in Iraq. It's not a question of whether Iraq's regime should be taken out, but when should it be taken out? It's not a question of whether you'd like to see a regime change in Iran, but how to achieve it.
Of course, it wasn't a fact at all. Quite famously, deeply not a fact. Exact same playbook, right? Down to the letter. In 2002, Ken Edelman on the Pentagon's advisory board told Americans in the Washington Post, quote, "I believe demolishing Hussein's military power and liberating Iraq would be a cakewalk." Now, Fox News is sending basically the same message directly to its biggest fan, Donald Trump.
Honestly, if we ever even got into a conflict with Iran, it would be over within 2 days, if that.
Well, if the guy on Fox News says it'll be over in 2 days, well, then I'm sure it will be. It's hauntingly familiar. The only reason that Donald Trump is deliberating at all, this 2-week deadline, which again, who knows what that means, is because there is a rift in his base with hardcore MAGA Republicans telling him, do not do this, because he promised them no new wars.
When I'm back in the White House, we will expel the warmongers, the profiteers, and take over our government, and we will restore world peace. And we're going to end these endless wars. They never stop. You ever see these wars? They go on for 14 years, 20 years. We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars that we end, and perhaps most importantly, the wars we never get into.
That's Inauguration Day, the wars we never get into. Now he's in office, and we're already at a point where a new war has started in the Middle East. That was started by Israel, right? It sure looks like we're about to go to war. And here's the thing. Every single Democrat in both houses could sign on to congressional resolutions trying to block him from bombing Iran, and he wouldn't blink an eye. But he cares about angering his base.
I don't know if they're trying to get us into a war with Iran or not, America, if Israel is trying to. I don't trust the Israel leader at all. I don't believe anything that guy says. And I don't think that our soldiers should have to go and defend stuff that they start. It feels like they're trying to push Trump to go do that. And it's like, who makes that choice? Does he make that choice? And then what do we get? What's the win for us? We're just involved in some other thing while we have suffering here at home.
Now, that individual, Theo Von, he's got millions and millions and millions of listeners. And he's been a Trump-friendly guy. And the threat of another forever war has been enough to incite the likes of MAGA-friendly podcaster Theo Von and disgraced cable news host Tucker Carlson and former Trump aide Steve Bannon. In fact, Bannon even coincidentally showed up at the White House for lunch with Donald Trump today. The other thing is that war with Iran is unpopular. Republican voters don't like it. Democratic voters don't like it. Independent voters don't like it. And yet, there's a concerted effort to, frankly, lie us into yet another conflict with BS and faulty intelligence. I mean, they keep saying, like, they can't have nuclear weapons. They were not on the precipice of having nuclear weapons. They just weren't. You could say they were, but they weren't. Or these straight-up deceptively edited videos. And I think this is a political opportunity for Democrats not to duck their head and see which way the wind blows, not to try to just stay silent, which a lot of them are doing, but to stand up and say no war with Iran. Absolutely not. It should be the bare minimum for our elected leaders, many of whom have already seen this scheme play out before.
Donald Trump's aggressive immigration crackdown is continuing to grip Los Angeles, with ICE raids picking up across the city. And today, ICE agents appeared at Dodger Stadium. The Dodgers confirmed in a statement that ICE agents came to the stadium and requested permission to access the parking lots, but were denied entry to the grounds by the organization. Their presence comes on the same day that an announcement is expected from the Dodgers on their plans to assist immigrant communities impacted by ICE raids. Now, just in the last hour, DHS released a statement claiming that the agents there were unrelated to any operation or enforcement. For more on that, let's bring in NBC News correspondent Jacob Sobroff, who is outside Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles. Jacob, good to see you. What can you tell us?
Alicia, it was a very tense scene here earlier at Dodger Stadium, and you can see that everybody has sort of dissipated for now. There's a couple of protesters left. In fact, I'll just show you sort of the remnants of the protesters that are here right now. You can see that there's a couple of people still milling about. But what we understand is that there's going to be a protest again at 7 o'clock Eastern time tonight here. There's a game between the Dodgers and Padres coming up this evening, and the Dodgers have been at the center of this conversation about all of these wide-scale immigration enforcement playing out across Los Angeles. You had those agents that were staging here after a series of immigration enforcement raids this morning at Home Depot in Hollywood, reportedly at a Costco in the Los Feliz neighborhood, in Paramount reportedly. There are potentially agents that were exercising an immigration enforcement activity. Even in the Coachella Valley in the desert, there are reports of immigration enforcement today. When I talked to Tom Homan the first Saturday of this immigration enforcement operation, he said, we're going to be doing this every day. Some days will be big, some days will be small. This feels like a big day. And to have this all taking place at Dodger Stadium has a particular significance to people here in Los Angeles. The Dodgers have not yet issued the statement that you mentioned about how they're dealing with these ongoing immigration enforcement raids in Los Angeles. Jaime Jarrín, the legendary Dodgers broadcaster, has spoken out about what's happening in Los Angeles. Kike Hernandez of the Los Angeles Dodgers. And it's all, I think, going to play out again in front of everybody tonight when the Dodgers face off against the Padres this evening, where we expect protesters to show up again, Alicia.
So, Broff, you mentioned the significance of Dodger Stadium. What is that significance?
Well, when Walter O'Malley brought the Los Angeles Dodgers here in the 1950s, there was a vibrant Latino community in Chavez Ravine, the neighborhood behind me. Palo Verde, Bishop, and La Loma were the names of the three neighborhoods. If you haven't read the book called Stealing Home by Eric Nussbaum, it's one of my favorites. It's great. Those communities were forcibly removed, evicted from Dodger Stadium, and there has been a love-hate relationship, I think it is fair to say, with the community here in Los Angeles. The majority of the Dodger fan base today is Latino, as is the population of Los Angeles. But the history of Dodger Stadium is one that is a very painful one for many Latinos in Los Angeles and many people all throughout Los Angeles. So to see this play out here today is a reminder of times past and a reminder of what we've been going through over the course of the last 2 weeks or so and what might play out in the days and weeks ahead, Alicia.
You have raids, it's my understanding, picking up across your city. Your sense of the level of fear, of frustration in immigrant communities, understanding, of course, that immigrant communities are very much interlaced with those of us who have U.S. citizenship.
Oh, fear is maximum. Fear is maximum because this has not stopped. And every day in a different corner of Los Angeles, you have seen something take place. Let me just swing the camera around right here. Downtown Los Angeles, just so you know, Alicia, is right in the distance. It's behind some of these trees, the palm trees right here. But in Chinatown, which is just below us, down the street that you're looking at right now, there were raids on some of the first days here in Los Angeles. To the other direction, this way, is Cypress Park, where that Home Depot on one of the first days of the raids took place. And I talked about on this very broadcast, those day laborers were taken from street corners, or at least attempted to be taken. And that scene plays out in a different corner of Los Angeles almost on a daily basis. It's a county of 10 million people, over 500 square miles. And it seems like, I feel like, in talking to people on the ground every day, that they feel like ICE is everywhere. And that is terrifying, not just undocumented folks, but mixed status families with children in Los Angeles public schools, mixed status families who have people in their church or in their workplace. Everyone knows somebody who's affected by this here in this city. And the protests, especially on Saturday, that have been largely peaceful, are all about, not about Donald Trump, not about anger at the administration. It's about getting ICE out of Los Angeles, and everything else comes after that, because this affects people's day-to-day lives right now.